Well, hello, friends. This is Between Two Sundays. It's Between Two Sundays, and Mark and I are going to talk about some readings between the two Sundays, whose readings we're going to be talking about. G'day.
Excellent. G'day. How are you?
I'm making a lot of sense. That's what I'm doing. Uh,
Good.
of course, we start each show by having a look at the readings from the Sunday that's just gone. Um, and, what stuck with us from there. We didn't talk about this during the show last week, but Um, in rereading the readings and chewing on them a bit further after we recorded the show, in Deuteronomy 34, in verse 8, there's this verse that says, the Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Um, and I reflected on why is this sticking out to me? And the reason why it seemed to stick out, I think, was there was this sense of we were led by Moses to this point, but we can't stop here because Moses is no longer with us. We need to keep going. We need to keep moving forward. We need to keep progressing towards this thing that God has called us to. And funny enough, after this reflection and then reading the readings for this week that we'll talk about in just a moment, there's I think a really important thing about the passage we'll be looking at this week that gets to this end. But this idea that there is a season for mourning, there's a season to be sad, there's a season to think about what has happened, and grieving for the person who's gone or the loss of leadership or whatever else there was. But after 30 days, it's over. It is now time for us to move forward. The period of mourning for Moses is gone, and now we must continue to grow forward. And I think this says a couple of things. First of all, not just first of all, for the hearts of followers, or for the people that are being led somewhere, that holding on to a particular person for too long, particularly after it's obvious that it is finished, for want of a better term, is probably not healthy. The flip side of that, of course, is for those who lead to recognize that there's going to come a point when they're no longer going to be required. They're no longer going to be needed, that everything's going to move on without you, buddy. And I think in this day and age, particularly of the mega church and the renowned and all this sort of stuff, keeping a level head and saying to ourselves, I might not even be remembered very soon. And there's actually absolutely nothing wrong with that. But what does that mean about the way I live and lead now? If it's not about me being remembered and me being followed forever, or even my teachings being held to for all of eternity because I've written a book or recorded a series of videos or what have you. Not that those things are wrong in and of themselves, but what's your motivation? Is it so that someone will read you and be able to quote you in 50 years' time? Or is it about making sure the people that you're with and you're leading and that God has you to support now are being looked after? And recognizing that, in Moses' case, 30 days after, it was like, we are now moving on. And so there was something really powerful about that for both sides of the coin, as somebody who has been led and as somebody who leads, thinking about both of those things. And it certainly makes for some interesting contemplation and probably very healthy contemplation, particularly in this day and age when we don't talk about death very well at all. And in my current role, I'm around death every day. I literally hold hands with people as they die. And it's certainly not that I had an unhealthy understanding of death. And when I say unhealthy, I'm not talking about that. I wasn't. Well, what I mean by that is, I think it's unhealthy when we don't talk about death, when we don't understand death well, when we don't talk about these things and think about what that means for us and start to live in a way where we remember that every one of us is going to die. I think that's really healthy, and always have. I have for some time anyway. But then on top of that, to live in the world that I do now, where I'm living around death every day, I think there's something about that reminds me of this very thing, of what's important, and focusing on those things that God's got me here to do. So yeah, we didn't talk about that at all last week, but that's what piqued my mind and my
Mm.
heart as I'd shoot on the readings again. How about yourself?
I found myself drawn to a couple of passages, but I want to highlight the end of Psalm 90 here. Let the favour of the Lord our God be upon us, and prosper for us the works of our hands. By prosper the work of our hands.
Mm.
This phrase, prosper the work of our hands, kind of as a prayer, so it's addressed to God. It reminded me of a friend of mine who came along to one of the studies that I run on a Wednesday evening, and he only came along once, actually. But what I remember about him, his reflections on the passage we were reading that night, was he wanted to say, the essence of faith is work, which we, of course, tend to want to pull apart. But here we have Moses working until he's 120, clearly a man of faith, a man of legendary faith. And my friend was saying, I think the two go hand in hand. Faith is not just trusting. Faith is often working towards something.
Mm.
And here is the psalmist saying what I think is a similar thing. We're going to work in the direction that we believe God is leading us, and we're going to pray that this work will be prosperous. It's sat with me somehow. I mean, he is a very hard worker, and so when he links faith to work, I work in trust that this will be worth doing. I get that sense with our discussions over the last year and a bit here online. I don't know where it's all going, but this feels like work worth doing.
Mm.
I feel that, on Sunday mornings when I preach in my church, this feels like work worth doing. Wednesday evenings when I do the open circle, this feels like work worth doing. I don't necessarily know where it's all going, but it seems that there's a sense of call, there's a sense of gifting, and there's a sense that I need to get on with the job.
Mm. Yeah.
So I wanted to put in a little bit of a plug for faith being expressed through the work of our hands.
Yeah. No, and that makes a lot of sense. If we believe in faith that we're heading in a particular direction, why wouldn't we then start working towards it?
Yeah.
In fact, our work is often probably evidence of that faith.
Yes.
And
yes.
belief. Here we go. It is the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost now, as we scream towards Advent. We're only about 4 or 5 weeks out now. And this week's readings are Joshua 3 verses 7 to 17, Psalm 107 verses 1 to 7, and 33 to 37, 1 Thessalonians 2 verses 9 to 13, and Matthew 23 verses 1 to 12. All of those are available in the Revised Common Lectionary, which we use from lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu. And before I forget, like I often do, just going back to last week's readings, I was saying to you before we hit record, we got a message comment on our YouTube version of the show from Steve Cylinder, who's a regular commentary, quoter, poster, anyway, commenter on our thing there. And he was bringing up the verse from last week from Matthew 22. And he was saying he used to be an assistant pastor and he said the question that was most often asked was, quote, "Is this a sin?" Referring to anything, I suppose. And he said, "I simply referred people to the Matthew 22 passage and said, remember these 4 words, love God, love others. If what you are questioning doesn't align with these 4 words, then you may consider meditating on why or why not," which I think
very
is
good.
a very interesting way of looking at putting up a lens with which to view where we're at. What are we doing here? Love God, love others. Does it fit?
Helping people answer for themselves. That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, sorry, I nearly forgot that. So back to the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost. As I said, Joshua 3, 7-17, Psalm 107, 1-7 and 33-37, 1 Thessalonians 2, 9-13, and Matthew 23, verses 1-12. Joshua, start there.
Sure.
Go for it, my friend.
This seems
like
such
that groan. What was that? What was that?
There's a little bit of me in Joshua. I've preached through Joshua before. We as a pastoral team did it, so it was quite a challenging thing to do. Gee, there's a little bit of me that finds even this story deeply disturbing. The driving out of people from their nations, the account of God being behind this, really the destruction of cultures. There's even though we don't see all of that within this passage, as I saw us entering into Joshua, the book of Joshua, there was a little bit of me that was just a little uncomfortable. Once again, we see faith and work, as we've discussed already today, alongside one another. God saying this will happen, but there's a whole lot of actions in this. And although we don't get to the war, this is a moment where, as the story is told, it is so clear that Yahweh is behind everything that will unfold from here. And I got to admit, I find myself a little increasingly disturbed by accounts like this in the Bible, and increasingly uncomfortable with them, and increasingly asking myself what's lost in the loss of these cultures. I think I said last week, I've been reading a lot on Indigenous culture here in Australia recently, and just the deep sense of, gee, what have we lost in the the knowledge of this land and of people and relating to one another, what have we lost in turning a blind eye to culture and saying our culture is superior over another, which I fear is sort of an account that comes an understanding of the world that comes out of passages like this. Yet Jesus is so radically for everyone. On Sunday, we preached at my church on the Good Samaritan, and it's such an extraordinary story for Jesus to tell, so radically inclusive, raising this expectation that we would find good service, love in the places we think are most unlikely. And I, as soon as you start to read the Bible through the lens of Jesus, I think passages like this, or passages like this and everything it leads up to, become very challenging to simply swallow on a surface level. So
Yeah, for sure.
I find myself wrestling with this passage. Yeah. So I don't know if that's a good reflection on this or not. I don't know if it's a helpful reflection, but that my gut feeling was here that it left me wondering what's going on here, and left me leaning towards Jesus rather than wanting to just take this story on face value.
I mean, for those who might be saying, come on, Mark Beresford, are you pulling a long bow here? Let me just say that one of the first books of in my first semester ever of a BTH back in 1993, I started, I think, or 92. I actually did a whole unit on the book of Joshua in my first semester. And as part of that unit on the book of Joshua, one of the options for the essay, the final essay, which I chose and got a high mark for, may I add, was talking about the military conquests of Joshua and what we see there. And I literally talked about the military maneuvers that Joshua used and compared them to modern warfare. And I did that by talking to Australian military officers, of which my dad was one. My dad was still alive, so it would have been before September 93 that I did this unit. So either first part of 93 or 92. I literally talked about the military conquest and how the maneuvers of Joshua backed up to modern military maneuvers. That's how militant this book is. It clearly shows military maneuvering. So, you can't get away from the fact that this book does this. As I read through this passage, I thought it was really interesting that it's almost a complete rehash of the crossing of the sea with Moses.
Yes.
And this is where I suppose I was getting to before, when I was talking about when I saw this period of mournings done. We're now moving forward from Moses, and yet one of the first thing that happens after Joshua is placed in leadership is Israel gets to experience an occasion that is almost identical, just in a different place, to what happened to them when they were with Moses. Now, granted, in that 40 years, there were people who were told, you're not coming into the promised land, and they would have been people who did that crossing. So in some ways, you could be saying this is a chance for these people to experience that same miracle when they wouldn't have previously. But I think there's also this way of the start of Joshua wanting to set the book of Joshua, wanting to set the person Joshua up as, this is our new leadership. This is the next Moses. This is the person who's going to continue to work that was started. So it's almost like this is the end of the transition that began with the 30 days is up. Keeping in mind that Joshua was one of the two spies who went into the land and came back and gave a positive report, and then worked very closely with Moses from that point forward. So Joshua would have been known to the people, along with Caleb. But what we see here is a miracle happening at the hands of Joshua, which basically places him in that position. This is very much a transference of power story of the leadership of Israel. And I think it's really interesting that, and here comes the cynic in me now, that while it could be just a literary device to set this person up, if it was an event that actually happened, it's interesting that it seems God needed to provide a miracle like this at the hands of Joshua for Joshua's leadership to be taken legitimately, which says perhaps, possibly, the people that were following, or some of the people that were following Moses, hadn't moved on like they had meant to. They hadn't let go.
That's
They weren't
interesting.
prepared.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this was something where God was able to say, guys, this is where your focus needs to be. This is the future. This is the way forward. Moses brought this far, but now Joshua is taking on from here. And it made me think about changes of seasons, of things where God does something for a while, but then God changes what God is doing. I just finished in the last couple of days watching the first season of the televised or the made for television version of Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman's book, Good Omens. And it is
Mhm.
fascinating watching. And some wonderful references back to the biblical story. It's a story about a good angel, obviously, and an evil demon who become friends. They're both assigned to work on Earth, and they become friends in that process. And every now and then, while they've got other things going on, trying to that have to do with the end of the world, there are some reflections on stories that are back in the scriptures. Um, the Garden of Eden comes up, Noah comes up. And there's some other references later on in an argument about Armageddon, whether it does need to happen the way that it seems things are meant to happen, or whether it doesn't need to happen that way, where this word ineffable comes up quite a lot, the ineffable plan of God. And there's this one scene where the angel Gabriel and one of the who's the leader in heaven and the leader in hell, Beelzebub, came on Earth together to try and sort this mess out, because it seems Armageddon has been halted by this angel and demon who've been on Earth for 6,000 years. And there's a bit of consternation about this, because Gabriel and Beelzebub saying we have to have a war. We've got to have a war. We've got to sort this out with a war. It's always a war. And Gabriel says, it is written. Guys, it is written. There has to be a war because it's written. And the Arazaphale, who's the good angel, says, so it might be written, but is it ineffable? And you see Gabriel stumble. And then the demon, whose name is Crowley, goes, oh, he stumbled. He doesn't know. And so Arazaphale and Crowley argue that, sure, it might be written, but is this the ineffable plan of God? This plan of God that is unknowable and unreaching and is beyond us understanding, which is a really interesting thought. And so here we have something along those lines, that there's this transference of leadership. And while everyone's saying, well, we need to go this way, sure, that might be what you see, but is it within the ineffable plan of God? And can we let God do what God wants to do and not try and shut God down? So sure, Moses is finished and here we are, and we're transferring to this new leader, and you're frustrated by this or scared by this or think he's too young or think he's not qualified or whatever else you want to do, and yet this is the person God has put up. Can you get past everything that you've believed about Moses and say, well, I'm going to give myself to God's ineffable plan and see where Joshua takes us? And so there's that they needed this sign is kind of really interesting to me, and tells me a little bit perhaps about how some people were struggling to move forward with Joshua in leadership. So anyway, again, how you squeeze that into your Sunday sermon, if you're preaching it, I don't know, but it's worth thinking about from that angle. Yes.
This is very clearly used and told as a story of great faith. So almost inevitably, as we read this story and preach on it, this is a great moment of faith, an extraordinary moment of affirmation.
Yeah.
And it's used as a story of great trust in Yahweh, which I think is interesting. There's something well, obviously I've said there's something profoundly disturbing about this story, but the way it's interpreted is not usually, I hope, not God ordains genocide, but this is a story of faith. And I wonder if we find ourselves using this story parabolically, allegorically, and really avoiding the rather embarrassing implications around genocide of it.
Yeah.
I'm particularly focusing on that list of cultures there, in the middle, and this this promise to drive them out.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I found myself wondering around the psalm. I mean, it's telling this story, isn't it, of how the Israelites, a reminder that the Israelites have been led through the land, and all the dangers they came across. And then right in the middle there, let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind. I found myself wondering, what is the psalm? What is this psalm put alongside this reading for? Is it to try and balance up some of these perceptions? Is it to try and say, even these dark times, these terrible acts that God is involved in, actually there's this ultimate sort of purpose to bring about good for everyone. Even that feels a bit hard to sit with, these two alongside one another. But maybe it's just the Jewish world telling their story, telling the story from their side. But I find myself, as soon as you get to Jesus and you see this very radical inclusivity and this invitation to all the nations of the world, I think you do find yourself saying, gee, I've got to sit in a bigger story than just my own story.
Well, I would argue that that story's there from Genesis 12. And that's what really bugs me about Psalms like this, and about what we're reading in Moses and Joshua. If the promise to Abraham was that you're going to go to the nations and be a blessing, when Abraham's brought up in this world where nations aren't blessings to nations, nations go and smash other nations so they can take them over. And yet this nation that God is raising up is going to be a blessing to the other nations. How do you go from Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3 to this? And that's exactly what you're saying too. I don't have to get to the Jesus story, because this story has been dogmarked from the start before we even got here. With this call of God to come away, become a great nation that's going to bless other nations, not conquer them, but bless them. And this is a story where you read this now, both through, Exodus, or through Deuteronomy, and then into Joshua and further. You're wondering, where is this gone? Where no wonder the story had to be redeemed. No wonder Jesus had to come along, and the prophets might. I mean, the prophets were calling this out long before Jesus was. So there's that there. That refrain, his steadfast love endures forever, which isn't a refrain in Psalm 107, but it certainly is in one of the other Psalms, at least one. And then you find it also turning up in Song of the Three. This is something that I think really draws out in the Psalm, that God's steadfast love endures forever. And yes, to the point where all humankind will know God's wonderful works. I'm also reading in this psalm. I'm not seeing in this psalm anyway, at least not in the verses that we're reading, that we're going out and we're smashing things. What I'm reading here is that we're crying out to God and He's delivering us. That doesn't have to be about smashing things. And so, you know, while it's, you hear this all the time that, oh, the God of the Hebrew scriptures is big, angry, ugly God, and then Jesus comes along and changes the story. I would argue that the story that Jesus tells is the one that's been inherent in the story of God, at least in the Christian scriptures from the very beginning. And nothing has changed except us. And of course, when we change, and you don't have to look far in the modern world to get this, when we change, we cry out in a way that seeks God's justification for what we're doing and twists God's story to make it so. I don't think there is much difference between the story that Christians are writing, some Christians are writing, too many Christians are writing today about what their mandate in the world is supposed to be, and the story that we see being told here in Joshua, particularly as we get further into Joshua, where Israel is telling the story of, we conquered these people and look, God was with us and God made it happen and God made it so. There's not much difference between that and the Christian nationalists, no matter what country that they're in, who are seeking God's justification to come against other religions, to come against LGBTQ people, to come against the story about God that they want to tell. So if you're a Christian who has another narrative, then you need to go as well. You're a part of the problem. You're not part of the solution. You know, this is not something, what we see here is not something that isn't visible today. And I think it's a human problem, not a God problem.
So what do you end up saying about Joshua 3? Is this a story, and you know, a very human story interpreted through the limited values of, you know, one nation's perspective on what should come across?
Well, when you understand that at the time, if two cultures went to war against each other, let's say Kingdom A and Kingdom B, when they came back from war, let's say Kingdom A won. Kingdom A's story would usually say, our God went against their God and our God won. Kingdom B's story would say, our God went against their God and our God wasn't strong enough. Or that our God let us down. Or our God was strong enough, but we upset our God. And so we never got to do it. Got to win. So we've got to sort ourselves out. And you see this in the text of Joshua.
Yes, you do.
You see them go out to war
when they get it wrong,
and they have to come back and say, what's the story? And it's because some dude's hidden the booty of war from a previous conflict, right? So you have that same thing right here in the text. So it's something that I think is a part of the human way of telling story, and particularly in the ancient world, when the gods were those that controlled all things and that you had to please the gods. This was a way of understanding, are we pleasing God? Well, we went to war and we lost. Well, we've really messed up then. We've got to get things sorted out with God. Let's either find out what we've done wrong or what someone did wrong and then get rid of the person or rectify the problem so that we can please God again, or cover it over somehow with offerings or whatever, what have you. And so
that's
again,
an interesting interpretation. That's a really interesting interpretation, Mark, because that would imply that Joshua, the story as a whole, is actually not just a story of my God is stronger than your God, but it's actually a story of humility within the community as well. This is not polished quite as much as we might like to initially suggest.
No.
There are these moments where, you know, if they are interpreting history through this lens, as you're suggesting, they're not just telling the good things about themselves, they're also telling those very,
Right.
very damning moments where they clearly aren't a people of faith.
Right. Which is why I think these stories are so important, because they tell us something about who we are.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I think we can trust that God is good. But what these stories tell us about how we act, how we react, and how we live, and how it all affects the way that we live and work and play and understand ourselves and our world and our theology to an extent as well. Right. Shall we move into the Christian scriptures?
Let's have a look.
First Thessalonians. Where did you go here, my friend? What jumped out for you here?
Very similar to what I said last week, actually. I found myself thinking as, Paul, with some distance between him and this community, so much so that he needs to write. This passage opens with what looks really, really egotistical, a self-proclaiming summary of what he has done among them. You remember our labor and toil. We work night and day. We didn't want to be a burden on you. We proclaimed to you the gospel of God, your witnesses. That's what got to me. And it's very similar to last week's passage. You are witnesses. Well, Paul is, on one level, articulating what he believes happened among them while he was there. On another level, his real appeal is not to me and my memory and my testimony about myself, but rather it's to theirs. And he's reminding and wanting them to remember. And clearly these things did happen, because otherwise, I think the Thessalonians throw this letter out as a load of rubbish. And he's gone on. We've had last week this beautiful image of the nurse. I was among you like a nurse. And today we have, we dealt with each one of you like a father with his children, urging and encouraging you and pleading that you lead a life worthy of God. So there's this extraordinarily relational language that's running through this whole letter, but especially in this little space. He's tapping into quite emotive language, really. Emotive language when it comes to relationship with these people. And I wonder if this is one of the reasons this letter was treasured, that it articulated something they knew was true, that Paul came and gave of himself, that was his mission. His mission was to represent the God who gave of God's self for everyone. And so when it comes to mission and ministry, Paul does the same. And so he can use this extraordinary, confronting, evocative language around, I've been among you as a nurse, I've been among you as a father. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. And a real rebuke to those who would think that mission is telling and walking away. I think Paul is a real rebuke to that in this letter. The way his mission is articulated is it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge to centralize love rather than centralize telling.
Yeah. There's two key senses afoot here. One is sight. You are witnesses.
Yes.
The other one is the ears. In verse 13, what you received, the word of God you heard from us, you accepted not as human word, but what it really is, God's word. But what strikes me as important here is the congruence between the two.
Yes.
That
Yes.
this is Paul talking the talk, but also walking the walk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because quite often you talk more, your walk talks more than your talk talks, as my Jamaican pastor, one of my early pastors, used to tell me all the time,
Yes.
with a Jamaican accent, which made it even cooler. But the point here is that you can't have one without the other. This is why, as I reflect on this, I wonder if I ever got asked to travel and speak again, would I do it? And I'm not convinced that I would, because I'd be flying in, having a say, and flying out, which is what I did for many years. But I'm looking at this now and going, I don't think that's possible to do with greater integrity. The greater integrity would be to not just go in and talk it, but to live some time there with people walking it so they can hear it, but they will see the congruence in it. It's one thing to go and say, believe this, but if they don't get to see that belief in action through the things that I'm doing, then what is the value of what I've just said? And if I've suggested that they do something, then if they don't see me actually doing it, then what is the value in what I just said? So what we have here is an appeal to both of those senses, and an appeal to those who are leaders in the Christian movement to make sure that both are happening. And I don't think it's good enough. And I'm going to say it outright. I don't think it's good enough when leaders have a fall from grace to say, oh, they're just human. Oh, this stuff happens. Yes, it does. I have no qualm with that. I would suggest the reason they had a fall from grace is because they weren't transparent enough to be living in community with the communities that they're leading and allowing their life to be a visible example of the stuff they were preaching on a Sunday. If you were living out the stuff you were preaching on a Sunday in action, rubbing shoulders with the people that you preached to every Sunday, my friend, you wouldn't have had a chance to fall in the way that you did. You wouldn't have had that opportunity because you would have been always with people, always rubbing shoulders with people, always sharing with people, always being among them, not hiding yourself away so you can pontificate from an ivory tower and prepare your sermon for the following Sunday, which is on writing your next book or whatever else it is that you do, rather than go and be salt and light, not just talk it. And so I think you're absolutely right, mate. I think this is an absolute kick in the goads to a culture that, again, we have today in a massive way amongst, even in smaller churches, that desire to, well, that the groundwork's been laid by those in larger churches and quite successful churches, that significance and you're doing the right thing when your church is this size, when you've written this many books, when your worship team has released this many albums, when you're traveling and speaking at this many gigs outside of being with your local community. Give me a pastor or a priest who is committed to their little core of 35 people or whatever it happens to be. It could be bigger too or smaller, but that people that God's called you to be with. Give me the person who's going to commit their lives to that, not just talk to them on Sunday, but who lives among them and works among them and does things in the community together with them, giving them and other people a chance to see the words that he preaches or she preaches in action on a Sunday morning. I think that's what a significant pastor looks like. I think that's what, and it comes back to what I was saying before, that sense of, well, what am I leaving behind? Well, if only 35 people's lives are changed by what you do, that's good. That's significant. You've made a huge difference in the world. This idea that unless you're the pastor of a mega church or you're famous or what have you, you're actually going to mean anything. Well, I think we've got to let go of that and push against that culture, which is rife, not just outside of the church, but within the church as well. The seniority, the elevation, the platforms that are given to people simply because of church size or number of books or how popular their podcast is or whatever happens to be the equation out there, the earmark. That's not God's measurement. That's not how God works. So why are we using that as the measurement? I think we've got to really let that go. And Paul is saying to us, particularly those of us who lead here, take a little bit of a personal check on yourself, buddy, and see where you're standing.
I find myself heartened as I think there's a positive take on what you've just said there, and that is, the rise of new monasticism, where people are saying, actually, I want to look at little communities. I want to look at little intentional communities, and how can I live my faith there? I dare say the vast, vast majority of pastors across the world are working in pretty small communities.
Yes, they are.
Where
it's
probably, where it's probably impossible not to live like Paul is suggesting here. And I find myself wondering if people are more and more drawn to that. One of the communities I run is, we would have 6 people on a Wednesday night, on a good Wednesday night. But, it's filled with people who are hurt by the church and don't go to church.
Yeah.
So the institutional side of things, they can't stomach anymore. On the whole, there are exceptions, of course, but on the whole, they can't stomach the institutional side of things. But the little community that gathers around Scripture is something very appealing.
Yeah. And don't let the titles, though, trick you. Yes, there is something about the draw to the new monasticism, but as somebody who is a literal new monastic, in a sense, through my Benedictine vocation, and somebody who hasn't striven for any sort of notoriety, but has just gained a following simply by sharing my story with people, and that's fine. I really don't care too much about the numbers, but if it's helping people, that's great. But there's a large number of people out there in that new monastic sort of scene who are not doing too dissimilarly to the megachurch pastor with the books and the platforms and all that other stuff.
Yes, of course.
And running down that way. And, it'll be interesting to see what happens when the new monastic type thing, when the mystic thing goes out of vogue, what they jump to then in order to sell their next make their next bit of money.
So
But, this is a teaching that I think reaches across all aspects. I think about our abbot. And the reason why I raise him is because our community is 30-something years old. And because of the way monastic communities become acknowledged by their denominations, we're only just entering that phase now. When you think about the fact that it can take up to 6 to 7 years for someone to become a fully professed monastic in a community, and ours is no exception to that, despite the fact that we operate differently to a traditional monastic community. Our abbot is a traditional monk, but our community, some of our community live the traditional lifestyle at the mother house, but predominantly most of us are spread out all over the world. But with still 7 years, I joined the community in 2016 as a postulant. And I'll be making my solemn vows next April. So that'll be just over 7 years of study and assignments and reading and reflection and contemplation and interviews and, you know, being led through that process. And I raise this because, you know, like I was saying, our abbot's been at this 30-something years. And we've got a very thriving community now. At one stage there, it wasn't very healthy, not because the community wasn't healthy itself, but in terms of numbers. If you went off numbers and numerical growth, you would say things weren't healthy. But he stuck to what he believed God had called him to do. And here we are today with a community that now has enough solemnly professed members, and more exponentially than that. And we are now recognized by the Episcopal Church of the US and therefore across the Anglican Communion. We already had the thumbs up from the Archbishop of Canterbury years ago. But there are certain things about, you know, like I said, anyway, the point is our abbot stuck to his guns with this fledgling little beast that he just believed God was calling him to birth. And here we are, 32 years later. And if I said House of Anish Nova and Abbot Michael John Austin, you would go, who? And that's the point. That's the whole point, because it doesn't matter. What matters is that he was somebody who had a call from God and pursued that call and was willing to stay with that, and still is staying with that, running the course that he believes God's called him to run. And it doesn't matter who knows him, doesn't matter who knows who we are. What matters is that we're doing what God has called us to do. And that's what really Paul is getting to here, I think. So that's just one example, and we could probably name many, many others. Like we said, those faithful priests, those faithful pastors, those men and women who are regularly serving these small communities of sometimes 15 people, 12 people, 90 people, 36 people, whatever. But that's their focus. That's where they're working. That's where they're honing in on. That's really what it comes down to and what really matters. Yeah. Which kind of, in a way, touches on what Jesus is saying to the people in Matthew. Because really what he's saying to the people in Matthew is, listen, don't ignore the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, the religious leaders around you. Do what they say, but don't do what they do because they don't practice it. In fact,
clearly the advice here is to be practices and teachers.
Exactly what we've
clearly the advice is to be consistent with what we've observed in 1 Thessalonians.
Yeah, that's right. This is Jesus basically saying the exact same thing as Paul has said, that, you know, your job is not to be seen per se. Your job is to, like, in terms of religiously, they love to have their place of honor at banquets, the best seats in the synagogues. You know, they do all their deeds to be seen by others. I would suggest to you that what Paul was talking about wasn't, I came out there and did stuff because I knew you were watching. What Paul was saying to the people was, we did what we knew to do, and you saw what we did. We didn't go out there to put on a show. We get out there to do how we knew that we were supposed to live, and you happened to see that. Whereas the Pharisees and the religious leaders are doing something completely different. But what's really important about that is, as you read through that list, and it's right at the start, and I would love to have seen Jesus put it at the end, because I think it would make it wouldn't make any less sense, but it would certainly give a lot of impetus and emphasis on what Jesus is just talking about. He said they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay it on the shoulders of others, but they're unwilling to lift a finger to move them. Because of the reason why they do that is because the whole way that they live is putting this emphasis on this idea of how the living's supposed to look. And yet that weight on people's backs just isn't possible. But they're not willing to do anything to relieve that burden and to show that pastoral care to them. They just want to see them do it. It reminds me of the pastor who couldn't understand why he was getting backlash from home group leaders who wouldn't come out on a Friday night for a meeting once a month at 5:30 in the afternoon and have a meeting and then move into dinner together. And the reason why he had backlash is because almost every single one of our home group leaders were full-time workers, and many of them had families. And their reaction to 5:30 on a Friday was, this time does not work for us. I'm not even home from work at 5:30 on a Friday, some of them were saying. And yet the pastor, well, I can be there. Why can't they be there? Well, because you're taking a paycheck to be there. They're not. This is added on top of the other things. So it wasn't that they didn't want to do the meeting. It was that there was this expectation that was put on them that was an extra burden. And yet this pastor couldn't understand how he was laying something on their backs that was far too heavy. And so again, there's a two-sided call here. One is to those who are listening to Jesus, who Jesus is speaking to, which is the crowd, to say, make sure you live in a way that's congruent with the message. There's also a very, very serious challenge to leaders here, and what we've been talking about, Jesus goes that same length to say, make sure that when you're pastoring the people, you're actually pastoring them. You're not laying stuff on their backs and being a burden to them, because that is not what pastoring people is about.
There's there's a very radical edge to this passage. By the time you get to the end, you've got one rabbi, one Father in heaven, one instructor. It really does present a limitation to our institutionalized, the habit of institutionalizing. Yeah. Clearly, it doesn't say there's no other leaders, but certainly in an ultimate way, you've got one leader and one to account to. And this one serves. This one is not looking for your service as much as serving you.
Yeah.
I think that's a great evidence of a good leader. And a great evidence of a leader worth following is, are they out for themselves or are they serving others?
Yes.
And I wonder if this passage kind of culminates in that that expression of the humility of God, which I know sounds like an oxymoron to some, but that is our story, isn't it? That God has come down and surprised us with behavior that is humble and serving and loving, rather than arrogant and condemning and rejecting. There's inherently good reason to follow this one above all others within this passage, and that is, this one is here to serve you, not themselves.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting too, like when I just scrolled to the top of the web page at the Vanderbilt Library where we read our lectionary from, which includes artwork. And at the very top in the banner for this week, the image is of, if you can imagine, someone who's cut at the waist but kneeling down with a bowl in front of them, washing the feet of a person in front of them. So that's a really interesting piece of artwork to reflect on in the light of these particular readings.
Yeah.
Which is really what we're talking about as we look at that. So, I find that, I find that intriguing. And I only just picked up on it as I scrolled to the top, knowing we're probably coming to a close shortly. I'm going to be rereading the readings for the week, and here's this image, and I'll hold it up. There it is there.
Oh, yes.
So you've literally got someone washing someone else's feet, which is exactly what you were talking about just then.
Mm. Yeah,
absolutely.
This is the great surprising thing about Jesus. And, while I think that's, that story that Jesus washing the disciples' feet occurs just before the crucifixion and resurrection. Up until that point, this is probably the most confronting thing Jesus does in front of them.
Yeah.
Yet all the time he's been using this servant language and inviting them to embrace this for themselves. I think that moment does pale into almost insignificance once Jesus goes to the cross and serves those who are killing him with his life. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm.
What an interesting set of readings. Joshua 3, 7-17, Psalm 107, verses 1-7 and 33-37, 1 Thessalonians 2, 9-13, and Matthew 23, 1-12. Again, you'll find all those at lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu. Just click on the side, the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, and you'll find them there along with some artwork, printouts, the works. And if you're listening and you want to share something that's been on your heart as you've reflected on these passages, why don't you drop us a line like Steve does and a few others have done in the past. Drop us a comment. If you're watching on YouTube, down below, drop us a message in the podcast host of choice. I think on Spotify at least you get a chance to drop us a message there. Drop a note to Mark at his website, barefootfollower.life. Jump over to Instagram, go to @monkindocs and throw me a direct message or comment on the bottom of one of my posts about comment about this, not about the post. I'll find it there. But yeah, let us know what you think, what you're hearing, what your heart is sort of saying about this stuff to you, because we'd love to hear it and share with it. Mate, I think we're done.
I think we are.
And we've only got 1, 2, 3, 4. We've only got 4 or 5 Sundays left, and then we're back into another rotation of the next year, which will be year B, and then we're done. And then we can have a holiday after 3 years of craziness.
That'll be nice. We'll find something.
Oh, I've got a plan. But we'll get there. Oh, and by the way, on Wednesday, well, if you're listening to this on Wednesday when it goes out, then it'll be All Saints Day. So happy All Saints Day, and may all the saints bless you, and may you be a saint with them. One of my favorite old Anglican hymns, that one about wish I were a saint of God, faithful, whatever it is, and true. And it's like that. Who are the people in your neighborhood from Sesame Street, but it's for Christians. One was a doctor, and one was a priest, and one was slain by a fierce wild beast. And there's no reason, no, not the least, why I shouldn't be one too. I'd love to be slain by a fierce wild beast. That'd be fun. Anyway,
very good.
With that, I'm going to go find a fierce wild beast. Peace and love to you all. See you, Mark.
See ya.
Bye now.